What unites these three different parts of the Atlantic system? What is it that makes this system go? And that, of course, is not just an academic question. The question that we're getting at here is who is responsible for slavery? Because what we're talking about is the system that brought slavery into existence. So it's a fraud question. Let's go back to the lecture slides. There are three things that will turn out to be common to all the three different stages, three common denominators that you can point to between the transportation, the production of the plantation goods, and the sale in the coffee houses in Europe. One is capital circulation. In other words, people investing money in order to make more money. The second is human labor. There's people working at every stage of this process. And the third one, which we're not treating this week, is state power. In other words, there are empires like the British, French, Dutch, Spanish, and so forth, powerful monarchies, states governed by kings, queens, emperors, and so forth, that provide the security, that provide the laws and the banking systems and all that, which makes this system, which allows this system to exist. So let's look at the first two, both of which are economic issues, economic factors, and then state power is a political issue, and that's what we're doing next week, and we're reading a treaty between some of these empires. Okay. So first, let's look at this Atlantic system through the lens of capital circulation. The lines that are shown here on the lecture are scaled according to how much the stuff is worth at each leg of this triangle trade. The first leg that starts in Europe and goes to Africa, somebody sends money and goods that are worth a certain amount of money to Africa, where slaves are for sale. The slaves are bought for the price that you can get for the money and the goods you bring there. Nonetheless, the line, the brown line here from Africa to America, is thicker, representing a higher value. How did that happen? Because the slaves are more valuable. You can get more money for them once you get to Barbados, mostly when we're talking about the British, when you sell them, than what you had to pay for them in Africa. And the reason, of course, that a slave is valuable in the New World is that here he can be put, or she can be put to work in the plantation economy, making goods that can be sold once again at a higher price in Europe. So the thickest line is the green one that runs from the Caribbean, from the sugar and other plantation economies back to Europe. Meaning that once again, not the stuff that you buy off the plantation, whether it's the coffee, the sugar, the tobacco, or the cocoa, is cheaper in the New World. And in order for the plantation to make any money, of course, you have to ship it to Europe, because there is no consumer demand if everybody is a slave in the New World. So you have to ship it to Europe. And by doing so, you can then sell it at a higher price to Europeans. So when you start with a small amount of money, you end up coming out of this operation with a large amount of money. And you have succeeded in being a good capitalist. You invest money to make more money. And this clearly ties the different stages of the system together. Money is being made. But of course, for this operation to work, where you make money by buying and selling things, you have to have markets in the first place, where the things you want to buy and sell are available. And that happens to be the case. If you start here in Europe, you buy ships, you hire crews, and you purchase goods. What do you need to buy it? Other than the ships, you have a shipbuilding industry that's already in place. You have people who are trained as sailors, and you might have to pay them a little more to get them to go on a year-long journey, or 3 months at least, when they're used to normally just hiring out for the summer in between planting and harvesting and so forth. And you also have to purchase goods that are in demand in Africa by the people who are willing to sell you slaves. Now, the kinds of goods, for the most part, that are most in demand in Africa are weapons, for reasons that we will see immediately. So now we're getting to the question, where do the slaves come from? Africans are being abducted, and that is how the story of Olaudah Equiano starts. The group that is reading the full biography will probably be talking about that, how as an 11-year-old Equiano was abducted into slavery off the farm where his parents lived together with his sister. Who is doing that? Europeans are not. They cannot live in tropical climates that have tropical diseases. It is not until the 1880s that Europeans figure out medicine that can treat malaria. So for Europeans to go into Africa to abduct people would be a suicide mission. Never mind that they would clearly stick out because of their skin color, so they can't just sneak into villages and steal people off the land, and they are also outnumbered. So it is the Africans themselves who are selling slaves. But to think of Africans as Africans is something that might occur to Europeans who are already beginning to think in racial constructs. And all Black people, if you have that racial construct, are essentially the same. If you look through it through a racist lens here. But of course, Africans are not a united group politically in terms of their culture, their religion, the languages they speak. They are tribal. They live in organized states with kings that are about the same scale as you might find in Europe at this point. But of course, the ethnic groups and the religious groups and so forth are so many more because it is a very large continent. Those tribes, in interacting with each other as part of tribal economics, abducting people in warfare is a long-standing practice that you find if you look at anthropology. For instance, among the Native Americans, if you read early colonial history, the Iroquois are abducting members of other Native American tribes. The ancient Germans, the Germanic tribes, did it, according to the accounts of Roman historians, to take people who you defeat in war as slaves to replenish your own manpower that you lost in that war, is essentially a form of economics. It is one way of contributing to the maintenance of the tribe and to strengthening what is most valuable, which is precisely the labor force. These slaves that are taken as captives are not free to leave, but then again, these are traditional societies where nobody is free. They are not anybody's property because, after all, we're talking about traditional societies where property as we know it doesn't exist. There is no private property. Stuff that exists in the tribe is shared by the tribe. There are not even families whose heads could be considered the property owners, but usually there is a clanship structure where extended families live and work together. And often you have matriarchs rather than patriarchs in charge. For the slaves, that means that they become part of that clan, part of the family in their lifetime. They will intermarry and adopt the culture of that clan, of that tribe, and their descendants are as free as anybody else in that tribe. So slavery in Africa is a traditional tribal form of slavery. It is not what the British call chattel slavery, and that is not to be confused with cattle. It's not about livestock, but chattel is an antiquated term that describes movable property at a time when the legal system really only was concerned with non-moving property, which is to say land. Once merchants started to appear on the scene, you needed some term to describe their stuff, which they claimed as their property, in spite of the fact that you could just pick it up and take it someplace else. So this legal construct of chattel, movable property, is also used to cover slavery. So unlike unfree laborers in a traditional or tribal society, slaves can be bought and sold. That, however, only happens after the moment when they are first sold to Europeans. They're not commodities, they're not goods in a marketplace in the African societies where they exist, although increasingly they become so. And that is because, say, if you have tribal societies interacting with each other, and in the year-to-year conflict, warfare between the tribes, some slaves are taken, some are released. It's even Steven. It's a sustainable system, if you will. Once the Europeans appear on the scene, some of these African states, the kingdoms that are located on the coast, gain an edge. And for them, the meaning of slavery and this slave taking changes. It is getting scaled up, almost industrialized, and they get to do it with this new machinery of war and violence that the Europeans supply them with, guns, gunpowder, ammunition, and that is the main good that Europeans sell to these African kingdoms. So then this becomes the exchange that enables Europeans to buy people and to sell them in the New World as laborers to the owners of the plantations. This marketplace, if you go to Barbados, the sale, the auction of the slaves takes place locally. The monetary side, however, is often settled in London or Liverpool. So the plantation owner, in most cases, never makes it to the New World. He works through managers and overseers, people who do all the dirty work for him, including the buying and selling and mistreating of slaves. And therefore, the sale of the slaves and then the purchase of the goods that the previous generation of slaves had produced to take them back to Europe, that is all accounted for in London or Liverpool, and it happens as line items in a ledger where people keep accounts with each other. The person who owns the plantation eventually gets a check from the merchant saying, after our transactions are all accounted for, I owe you £1,000. And then finally, the last leg of this cycle before we start over is you have to pay off the ship crews, you have to settle your accounts, and then you have to get those goods sold to the public. You have to supply the coffee houses. Now here, the merchants actually become, to use a modern term, market makers. There was no retail market for tobacco, for coffee and such like. They make that market, they build that network. They don't sell these goods themselves. The merchants that run this trade don't run the coffee houses, but they go through subcontractors, if you will, small-time entrepreneurs who, perhaps with a loan from the merchant, or with the goods on commission, set up shop in their coffee house. Another necessary common factor in all these stages of the system is human labor. There is people, thousands of people, who do what they do for a living. That is simply what they were trained. You know, the sailors, they go to sea, they're competent at taking ships from one place to another without getting them sunk and lost on the way. Many of them, of course, start developing severe pangs of conscience to see people treated like the slaves are. Here are the beginnings of anti-slavery sentiment. If the group will introduce the movie Amazing Grace, there are examples of people involved in the slave trade who are hit sometimes overnight and all of a sudden with a terrible sense of guilt over what they did. Nonetheless, the sailors don't profiteer from this system. They are getting paid their wages and they go back home and they give the money to their families, and it is part of their income. It is what they do for a living. And the same is true if you look at these African societies where the tribes on the coast, the kingdoms on the coast, raid the interior and maintain this increasingly traveled one-way street of sucking the life force out of the hinterland by abduction and selling millions of people to the Europeans. They also don't get rich by doing that. It is to them simply an extension of what they've always done, the tribal warfare way of life, the warriors of the king who get a share of the loot, and now increasingly that loot is European goods, especially weapons and so forth, that are brought in by the Europeans. And for the plantation labor in the New World, the millions of man hours that are spent, and woman hours, I suppose, on producing all these goods without pay is what the slaves have to do for their survival. They are forced, with the threat of violence, it's a system that is based on forced labor. Nonetheless, on a day-in, day-out basis, the daily life under slavery, you're also just trying to get by and make things bearable, make things survivable, maybe hopefully take care of your children, of your family, and so forth, within the severe and harsh conditions of the system. So clearly the slaves are also not profiting from this, just like the tribal warriors who carry out the abductions, just like the sailors who man the ships. The labor that is essential, because without this labor, the stuff that is for sale on the market would simply not appear on the market. No tribal warriors means no slaves for sale. No slaves working on the plantation means no plantation goods. No sailors working on the ships would mean no trade. So the labor is essential, and it is part of what makes for a common denominator. But really what keeps the system going is the conversion of human labor into capital. And this is where this system truly shows its colors as a precursor to capitalism. Not just in the way that we discussed in the beginning, that capital is augmented by investing money in order to make more money, that you valorize capital by buying things cheap and selling them dear. But rather it is also the accumulation of capital. And when you look at where that happens, it is in Europe, it is in the bank accounts of planters, of merchants, of bankers. A large chunk of that is still the British nobility, the dukes and barons and so forth, the old nobles, the aristocracy. They are the ones who in the end get the fat check. Everybody else just gets daily existence out of it, the people who do the work. The slaves get the shortest end of the stick. Africa, as a continent, as a society, gets an equally rough deal in that the continent is deprived of many millions of people in their prime who are of working age. They and their descendants do not get to contribute to the economy and culture of Africa. So the long-term effect on Africa, the impoverishment of the continent, is a direct result of this. And yet, as you can perhaps see, to look at slavery merely through the lens of black versus white in racial terms, or Europeans versus Africans, doesn't quite do this system justice. But rather it is one group of people, a fairly small group of people in the old world, in England, who are the main perpetrators, the main benefactors of the system. So that in the yellow box there, the L with the slash through it, that's the symbol in currency. For the British pound, if you know the dollar symbol, that's obviously the US dollar. If you're not familiar with it, instead of dollar signs, we're accumulating the pound, the British pound, that L shape. So this is where the money goes. And if you want to look at what the purpose of the system is, then what you can see here is every single step of it contributes to enriching people in the old world, in England in particular. So that then leaves the question, how and why do they get to do that? How do they get away with it? And the political side of it, the government aspect, the empire aspect, is an important part of that. But that's a whole nother can of worms, which we will not open until next week. So we'll conclude this lecture here, and hopefully the group will tell us more about Equiano and his life and time.